Good evening.
Good evening.
Tonight we've got a question that is one that maybe you've pondered before, or maybe one that you've never given any thought to. And the question revolves around Christ, specifically, what did Jesus know from the time that he was born? Now, when we ask that question, one, it will be a little bit of a difficult question to answer, but I think it has a reward in trying to find the answer. But the other thing is that we want to identify exactly what we are talking about. So you might have, at some point, again, you might have kind of had these thoughts. When we're asking what did Jesus know from birth, we mean something like, did he know that he was the Son of God from the time that he was born? Or you could ask very similar questions to that. Did he know that he was the Messiah from the time that he was born? Did he know that he would have to die on the cross for the sins of the world from the time that he was born? Did he know the future from the time that he was born? Did he know what other people were thinking from the time that he was born? Did he know everything? And those are the questions that, again, maybe you've thought about, or maybe you haven't, and they'll keep you up tonight. But these questions, while they may not have a direct answer, again, I think there's a benefit in trying to study out and answer to them. And so, as we do this, we'll give a little bit of background about the person of Christ and why this question even comes up. And then we'll look at what the Bible reveals as far as what we know for sure that Jesus knew and when he knew it, and then have to speculate just a little bit to say, well, where does that really leave us? And then also ask the question, what difference does it make to us? Well, let's start with some background. The background about this particular side of Christ is really just a reminder of who Christ is. And so there are a couple of truths that we want to acknowledge about Jesus before we get into this question. One, Jesus has always been. He has always existed. There is not a point in time or outside of time where Jesus ceased to exist. And so, it is necessarily understood, not only has he always existed, but because he is God, he has, at all of those points, been all-knowing, or the term omniscient is used. But he knows everything because he is God. God the Father knows all. Literally anything that can be known, God knows. Same thing for Christ the Son, and the same thing for the Holy Spirit. And so, on those grounds, it would be kind of easy to answer this question by saying, well, Jesus is God, therefore he knew all things at all times and would have known all the answers to these questions that we've asked since birth. But to answer the question that way is to ignore the other side of Christ and what Christ chose to do. And so there are several times in the New Testament that Jesus reveals a sort of change that happens as he goes from being God in heaven and then coming here. I don't think it was intentional, but one of the songs that we sang tonight was Out of the Ivory Palaces. That whole song is a reflection on Christ coming to earth, leaving heaven, and leaving behind quite a bit as he does. So he leaves heaven, and what does he do? Well, according to the text of the New Testament, he, number one, in John chapter 1, verse 14, he became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay? Christ became flesh. Well, that certainly changes what he had been to what he becomes while on earth. In Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman. Okay? So he's become flesh, and he's been born of a woman, as all of us have. That's certainly different as well. Then we get to the text of Philippians chapter 2, and in verse 7. Philippians 2, verse 7, it says, rather he made himself nothing, by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in the likeness of man. Okay, so another way in which Christ is described as, yes, he has always existed, he was all-knowing, and he is God, but he made a decision, and that decision had consequences. He chose obedience, he chose submissiveness to the Father, And part of that, as the New Testament describes, is that he became a human. He also was God. We won't ever take that away from him at any point in his existence. But he took on the limitations of a human. We'll explain those limitations a little bit more as we go through. But that's where this question starts to come up. What did he give up to become a human? Well, when it comes to his knowledge, it seems that has to be part of the equation. That he, being a human, did not and could not know exactly what God the Father and God the Spirit knew at that same time. Now, I'll go ahead and also make the statement. Since Christ has returned to heaven, he is fully God in all ways and fully knows all, just as he always had. So there's no question of that today. We're talking about a limited period of time where Christ chose to give up of himself, of his own willingness, some of these attributes. So let's start asking the question. And the first thing we can do is we can give a couple of hints. Well, the first one is a definite answer, and the second one gives us a pretty good idea, and then we'll have to go on from there. What did Christ know as far as his deity, as far as his being the Messiah, as far as his power on earth? What did he know, but also when did he know that? Well, the first answer is really easy. Christ knew that he was the Son of God by the time he was about 30 years old. Can we agree to that? He knew for a fact. When he says, before Abraham was, I am, yeah, he knows. He knows full well. When he says that I and my Father are one, he knows exactly who he is. And there is no question. He knows the day that he will die, and he predicts that to his disciples. He knows all of these things. And so there's really no question, as an adult, Christ knew who he was. Okay? But how far back can we take that toward his birth? And of course, there's only one place to go, right? In Luke chapter 2, whenever Christ is seen at the age of 12 in the temple, he responds to his parents famously who have searched for him. He says in Luke 2 and verse 49, part of the text that was read for us, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" Now, there's a little bit of a question as to whether he means that fully about his Father in heaven, but we've got a pretty good idea there that he seems to understand who he is, and that his Father's will is what was most important. That's what he was doing at that time. And so I think it's probably fair to say from about age 12 that Jesus knew that he was the Son of God. I don't know if he had a full understanding of everything else that would mean, but he at least knew that, and he at least knows that from a relatively young age. But where do we go from there? Because you've still got several years back toward his birth that we really don't have much of an idea about. So we don't know if Jesus knew his true identity before this point, but there's another question we can ask that I think is useful in trying to understand and answer here. And so the other question is, when or how did he gain this knowledge in the first place? And so there's probably three options for this. Where would Jesus have found out that he was the Son of God? Where would he have learned that he was the Messiah? Where would he learn all of this? Option number one, he learned it through his own study of the Old Testament. Can you study the Old Testament and find out that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God? Yeah, you can. You should. A lot of people missed it in his day, but then again, a lot of them didn't. And the early Jews that were converted, the early Christians, they went back to the Old Testament. They found that answer. And so he certainly could have, just through his own study, recognized, hey, this is me. This Messiah, this is all about me personally. That's possible. And I think it's probably part of the reason that he comes to this understanding. But there's another reason that's more direct than that. In the text of Luke chapter 2, in verse 19, if you're still open there to Luke chapter 2, verse 19, after the events of Jesus' birth, it records Mary, or of Mary. It says, "But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart." Where else could Jesus have learned that he was the Messiah and that he had entered the world to bring peace and glad tidings to all mankind? He could have learned that from his own birth story. He could have learned that from his parents. And certainly Mary kept these things in her heart. She was thinking about these things. So unless she withheld the information from him intentionally, it's pretty likely his parents were a big source of his understanding that you were born in a special way. It was recognized as soon as you were born, before you were born. Your own cousin, while he was still in the womb, leapt for joy, recognizing you as being something special. These men that we've never met came and gave us very valuable gifts because they thought that you were something special. His story around his birth was not hidden. It's not as if no one knew. That's why Herod tried to kill him for it. So there's a lot that he could have learned just from his own growing up in his own household. So those are both two options that I think make a lot of sense as to how he could kind of come about this knowledge naturally, just through the course of life. But the other option, and the option that I think people still are tempted by, is that maybe he could have known these things just because he was God. And that being God, that he would therefore know all things, as we talked about. But when we make that suggestion that he knows this just because he is God, there are two big problems. The first problem we've already addressed. The first problem is it ignores what the New Testament says about him becoming human. And it ignores what the difference is maybe between being man and being God, and being fully one or the other of those, where Christ ends up being fully both of those. But it ignores a choice that he made to leave behind the full advantages of being God. And certainly he did leave those things behind. So there's that side of it, but there's another side of it as well. The other side of it really deals not directly from Scripture here, but from common sense and from our understanding of what it means to be human. Christ really could not have always known that he was the Son of God while on earth, and he really can't know everything there is to know while on earth because a couple things. One, he grew. He grew. Now that's pretty simple, but he did. He grew. Again, in the text that was read for us in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, Luke chapter 2, verse 52, it says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men." Can God the Father increase in wisdom? He cannot. God the Father cannot increase in wisdom. That would imply that there's something for him to increase into, that there's room for growth. Now, for Christ, who gave up that advantage of having all wisdom and all knowledge, yeah, he can grow a little bit in stature and in wisdom, and that makes a lot of sense. Beyond that, again, just on the common sense side of things, my children are smart, right? Your children are smart, hopefully you think so. Can they, from even my children's age, can they understand, can they be self-aware of a lot of things, but especially if they were the Son of God? Can they be aware of that? Is it physically possible in the human mind to be aware of that at that age? Is it physically possible for Christ in infancy to know that he is the Son of God? And what would that even be like, being sort of trapped in this helpless body, knowing who you are and not being able even to change your own diaper? Isn't that a strange concept to even think about, just from a common sense perspective? And so if we're going to say that Christ became flesh, and that has a real meaning behind it, then he's going to have the limitations of the flesh. And one of those limitations is an underdeveloped mind as a child, because that's how God has designed the body to work. Now, that being said, I suppose it is possible that God the Father made an exemption. He made this into a special case where instead Christ was fully human but somehow still had this knowledge from birth. Maybe. But that kind of brings up some other questions that we would have to answer. What's the purpose? What would the purpose be that God has in mind? It's not enough to just say God can. You have to have some idea of why God would do it. And I don't really know what that would be. Maybe you can come up with a good suggestion for that. But why would God do it? Beyond that, a different question. When it says of Christ that he was tempted in all points as we are, does that create a challenge there? Would you be as tempted as any other person if you already knew that you were the Son of God from whatever age? Wouldn't that change your perspective? Wouldn't that give you maybe a leg up on the rest of humanity? So that's just a consideration. But really, what would the advantage be for Christ coming to this knowledge miraculously, which it would be miraculous intervention for God to implant this knowledge into the mind of a toddler or an infant? But again, what would the real purpose behind that be? And so we can discuss that, and maybe that's a realm still of question. I'm not going to tell you what to believe on it. But it does mean that most likely what we could guess about Christ and his knowledge is that he came to a knowledge of his identity and of his purpose in life kind of slowly. In the same way that you and I do over time. Certainly with the advantage of the old law, which he would have studied thoroughly. Certainly with the advantage of his growing up in a household that was familiar with the specialness of his birth. And so he would have known from an early age, definitely. But that doesn't mean that he necessarily knew from the time that he was born, but could have come about this knowledge by natural means. So, to make a few applications, but to start with this, just to clarify what we're saying. Whether or not Jesus knew from the moment that he was conceived, that's a whole different question too, but from the moment that he was born, at least, whether or not he knew that he was the Son of God, he was the Son of God. Okay? So it doesn't really matter if Christ knows or he doesn't from the moment of birth. What matters is that it's true. And that he would find that out, that he would act on it, and that he would act accordingly. Because he was God from start to finish, from beforehand until after his death, the whole thing. He was God. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he has to know that, especially if he's chosen to give up knowledge in order to become like you and like me, and have a limited capacity for knowledge and understanding, just as we do. Isn't that one of the things that makes us most human in comparison with God, is how limited our understanding is? And so for Christ to not take on that part of humanity seems difficult to balance with our understanding of what it is that he did. Either way, also, whether he knew from birth or whether he didn't know until he was 12, I don't think that's really possible. I think he knows earlier than that. But either way, it's probably that he remembers this as far back as he can remember. Especially if his parents were actively involved in teaching him the things that happened when he was born. It's kind of like asking us, when do you remember that you had parents? Well, you don't really remember that. And when's the first time that you remember sunlight? Well, you don't really remember that. It's just like it was always there. And for Christ, that's probably true. Probably about as far back as he can remember, he had this understanding, I'm special, I'm different, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God. Something along those lines. The other problem with the understanding that's different from what we're kind of coming up with tonight, if Christ does know all things, or if he knows that he's the Son of God from the time that he's born, that makes him almost not human in the first place. And what it does is it almost gets you back to a very early heresy in the church called Docetism, which has come up before. But it's this idea that says that Christ was too holy to ever really be a human. And again, this is just people early on in the church kind of trying to rationalize something that wasn't true. But they said Christ was too holy to become human, and so really he was God the whole time, and that human body was just a puppet, just a figure, just a physical manifestation of him, but it wasn't really him. He was never there, because that just couldn't happen. Well, that's almost what we're saying here, that Christ is too holy to ever be limited in knowledge. Well, Christ is too divine to have this limitation placed on himself. But if Christ says, I became flesh to dwell among you, and I was born of a woman just like you were, and I gave up these things intentionally, At some point, we have to believe that and say, wow, he gave up that. Not just that comfy place in heaven, he gave up what makes him God for a short time in order to experience what it's like to be like me. Another question that comes up with this, and we brought this up at the beginning, did Christ know everything on earth? We've kind of focused more on the side, did he know his identity? But did he know everything? Well, there's a couple ways to answer that. I think Christ knew a whole lot of things after he received the Spirit. The reason I say that is because you run into the same problem. If Christ knows all things, or if he can perform miracles, or if he knows what other people are thinking when he's a 15-year-old, that's kind of weird. And you're going to have to work around the difficulties and the advantages that gives him over other people in not being tempted. But instead, what it appears as though is when he receives the baptism of the Spirit and receives the Spirit descending upon him like a dove, that he receives the miraculous knowledge of the Holy Spirit much the same way that the apostles would after him. And so from that time on, he can accurately say, here's what's going to happen in the future. He can tell you, oh, that's what this person is thinking right now, even without them speaking. And he can perform miracles from that point on. It's not until after he's baptized that he performs his first miracle, according to how the history of the Gospels records that. And so that's one side of it. Did he know everything? No, but from the time that he had the Spirit, he knew everything he needed to know, and everything that the Spirit wanted him to know. And so that's certainly an advantage. But the other side of it is, did he know everything? I don't think so. Did he know the history of China? No. A lot of it hadn't happened, for one, yet. Did he know the events that would happen in 2024 in the United States, on earth? I mean, did Christ know that while he was on earth? I don't think so. And the other side of that is, why would he need to? What purpose would that possibly serve to him in growing up in Nazareth and growing up as a human, and then everything that he needs to do in order to fulfill God's will? It doesn't help him. The other problem is, did he know everything on earth? Can I know everything on earth? Is your brain physically capable of holding all of the information that God's mind can? Not even close. So again, there would have to be a miraculous exemption just for Christ to be omniscient, unlike any other human that's ever been. Because all we can grasp is this tiny little thing. I mean, we read a book and we remember about 2 sentences out of it. That's our limitation. And Christ was limited, but he had more than we did based on the miraculous ability of the Spirit, like we said. Another question that I thought might come up with this, if he had this knowledge from a very young age, like we said, maybe as young as he could even remember, if not from birth, then why didn't he act on it sooner? If he knew that he was the Son of God, if he knew that he was going to be betrayed, or he knew that he was going to have to die on the cross, why not act sooner? And I think the answer's kind of already been given. If he knows he's the Son of God, why doesn't he act sooner? Because he knows he's the Son of God. Because he knows that he is here to do his Father's will. Now, interestingly, with that, we looked in Luke chapter 2 and verse 49, talking about that when he was in the temple, he answered his parents, saying, "Do you not know that I must be about my Father's will?" Well, later on in his ministry, he would appeal to his Father's will quite often and say that I'm doing the things of my Father. Well, God's will, the Father's will, when he was age 12 was what? That Christ would increase in wisdom and that he would gain favor with God and with men, that he would study the Word of God, that he would prepare himself and mature and be ready. God's will for him, the Father's will, when he was 30, was entirely different. It was to speak the message, it was to seek and to save the lost. God's will when he was 33 was something different as well. And so he was always, from start to finish, doing exactly what God wanted him to do. But that's why he doesn't act. He acts according to God's plan, not on his own timing. The last thing we'll say tonight is that if we're right, or half right, about everything we've talked about tonight, I think it can add something to our appreciation of Christ. And it should. Because if I look at Christ and I see him as having come to earth, having to leave behind some of the niceties of heaven, but really still being fully advantaged in the same way that God is. And basically, I've just put God on earth with all the same power and knowledge. If that's my view of Christ, then Christ didn't give up all that much for me. But if instead I recognize that Christ, being fully God, decided, I'm going to give up most of what makes me God in order to experience most of what it's like to be man, then things start to change. Because if he really becomes flesh and dwells among us, and he really is born of a woman just like we are, then what had to happen? It means that Christ, the all-powerful, all-knowing, became Christ with no power that knew nothing for a short time. It means that Christ, just like you and I have the experience before we remember it, of discovering our toes for the first time and playing with them when we're just a little infant. It means that Christ learned to write his name in Hebrew for the first time. It means that Christ had to learn how to drive a nail in his father's carpentry shop for the first time, because he became human, just like you and just like me. He gave up not just the spot in heaven, but every advantage that came with it, so that he could experience the fullness of the human experience, so that he could experience death, just as each of us will. Christ gave up everything in order for us to be saved. This evening, I hope this has been interesting, but again, I hope that it helps to maybe change our perspective just a little bit on who we see Christ as being. Not just the all-powerful, which he was and he is today, but also Christ as the helpless that he chose to be in order to be like you and me, in order to save us. And tonight, that's an opportunity that we cannot waste. What Christ was willing to do means that we can be saved. It means we should be willing to do anything in response for him. And tonight, if you need to become a child of God, this is the opportunity. Tonight, if you need to come to Christ for some other reason, now is the time. If you'll come as we stand and as we sing.